So the University of Notre Dame was founded in 1842 in the cornfields of Indiana, and it has grown to be one of the great universities of the United States. And we have been in London as the University of Notre Dame since 1968. So we're coming up on our 50th anniversary in a year. And we have over 500 students that come to the University of Notre Dame in London every year. So a significant percentage of our students, both undergraduate and graduate students, come to the University of Notre Dame here in London every year. We also have other gateway facilities in Rome, in Jerusalem, in Dublin, and several other centers, but this is our sort of crown jewel in terms of presence overseas, and it's the kind of program that the students are oversubscribed in terms of their desire to be here. So we're thrilled about the program here. We're thrilled about this building. This building is a listed building that was a former Oxford and Cambridge club, and so now it is graduated to a University of Notre Dame club. And so we have this wonderful facility that we use. We have dozens of classes here in the building every semester. And we have a separate facility just across the Thames that is our dormitory facility. And so the students really have an amazing, amazing place to study and to experience. And the professors here in the building are British academics, academics like Boika, Sokolova. So we're thrilled that you're here. We're thrilled to showcase an event like this. If there are university leaders, faculty members, administrators, we would love to talk to you about how we can partner together in a whole variety of ways, including the use of this space. So Dr. Charlotte Parkin, my colleague, can you stand, Charlotte? And I are working constantly to try to strengthen relationships with the various universities here in the United Kingdom, and we would love to talk to you about ways that we can work together through the classroom or otherwise in terms of engagement. So welcome to Notre Dame. We're glad that you're here. I want to now introduce Boika Sokolova. Boika Sokolova has been our resident Shakespeare expert here at the University of Notre Dame in London for the past 10 years. She's an accomplished author on The Merchant of Venice and is focused on also the appropriation of Shakespeare throughout Europe. And really, truly, Boika is responsible for this event tonight. And we're just thrilled to have her as part of our faculty. And I would welcome Boika to please come to introduce our speaker. Thank you, Boika.
Welcome to the annual lecture in honor of Professor Stanley Wells. For 6 years now, we've been gathering here in Trafalgar Hall to hear renowned academics and theatre practitioners to share with us their insights into Shakespeare. Tonight, however, is special. I'm delighted to be able to congratulate Stanley on the knighthood he was awarded a few months ago, an honor long and well-deserved. Sincere congratulations, Stanley. On this occasion, it is my great pleasure to present our distinguished speaker, Greg Doran, Artistic Director of the Royal Shakespeare Company. Greg, who has held this post since 2012, has a long career in theatre, and it is a hard call to do it justice within a few short sentences. How do I trace the career of someone who has worked his way from an actor to being one of the most eminent directors of his generation and is at the helm of the main Shakespeare company in the country? How can I briefly sum up the work of a director who has done most of the plays in the canon, taken Shakespeare to millions of people, and whose interests extend far beyond the national poet? The academic literature abounds in discussions of his individual productions, But there is no scholarly chapter about him as a director in a history of British theatre. So this is a task which really has to be done by somebody. So here I resort to my own experience of his productions, the web and the grapevine. Greg Doran's involvement in theatre began in Preston, a town of rich Anglo-Catholic history, where at his Jesuit school he played Lady Anne in Richard III, and found the experience of standing up to malevolent Richard in the character of a bereaved woman both exhilarating and empowering. After a degree in English from Bristol University, he became an actor, emerging on the RSC stage in 1987, where Stanley, among others, noticed early his talent. One of Greg's first parts was in Julius Caesar, where he doubled as Octavius and a plebeian. As if preparing for the position of an artistic director in times of financial austerity. Terry Hands, who was directing him in that production, is reported to have said in one of the rehearsals, "Greg, there are 100 ways of saying this line, and you haven't found any of them." Which, again, in retrospect, sounds like really good advice to an artistic director who always needs to think in options well beyond the figure of 100. Actors love working with Greg. As he mentions in an interview, he prefers to ask them what they would like to play rather than ask directors what they want to do. This open and generous relationship seems to be one of the several keys to his success. He's well known for giving ample time for table work at the start of rehearsals, allowing his casts to understand and explore the text. His productions are both modern and imbued with the flavour of the rich heritage of British theatre. He brilliantly brings together present stars like Anthony Sher, David Tennant or Harriet Walter with actors from the older generations in productions where young blades display their craft and prepare for future stardom. I shouldn't forget to mention the particular attention he has paid to diversifying the racial and ethnic background of the company by giving major parts or mounting whole productions with such casts, which is essential to making the RSC a truly national theatre. Elegant, finely crafted and light of touch, Greg's art delights and enchants. I'll never forget the 13-year-old sitting in front of me at Tennant's Hamlet, whom I almost forgot to watch for watching them. Nor the ripples of awe coming from children in the theatre at A Midsummer Night's Dream, a production of unforgettable theatrical magic. His Sejanus was a revelation, while The Swan has become a treasure house for plays by Shakespeare's contemporaries and for exciting new work. Happily, some of Greg's productions now exist on film, like Julius Caesar, set in Africa, his brilliant, devastating Macbeth, and the Henry IV plays. Greg was one of the driving forces during the World Shakespeare Festival, has taken the company far afield to China, but most importantly, he fulfills the mission to educate young generations through the marvel of theatre. He is putting on all plays in the canon within a few consecutive seasons so that children growing up now can see all of them as they move through school. Times, difficult as they are, have rarely been more propitious for doing Shakespeare. The last 5 years have offered a feast of performances and celebrations which David Garrick could not have imagined in his wildest dreams. To tell us of the year 2016, we have the privilege of hearing Greg Doran.
Thank you very much. Live up to that. Actually, what Terry Hand said was, Greg, there are 100 ways of saying a line of Shakespeare except for the way you do it. To which I responded, well, Terry, there are now 101. Ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to be invited to deliver this lecture this evening in honour of the much admired Professor Sir Stanley Wells. And I'm delighted, of course, that it's the 6th annual lecture, but of course the 1st annual Professor Sir Stanley Wells lecture. So I'm even more honoured. Could there have been a more appropriate year in which to award a knighthood to Sir Stanley than 2016, albeit not before time? Thank you for inviting me. You'll notice my little badge, which I was in a bar the other day and somebody said, I love WS. Is that West Sussex? Of course, in honour tonight is in fact, in a rather Shakespearean way, I love Wells Stanley. I'm not very good at lecturing, I'm better at talking. I'll talk for about half an hour or so, and then please, I will open it up to questions. So if anybody has any questions they'd like me to talk about or elaborate on things I've said, then please do ask me. I've often said that Shakespeare is a passport through your life. It's certainly been a passport through my life in a very literal way. It's taken me from Madrid to Moscow, from Beijing to Joburg, from Tokyo to Trinidad, and New York to Hong Kong. And every stage of that journey has been articulated by Shakespeare's words. So I was delighted when my actual passport came up for renewal this year. To my delight, when the parcel arrived from HM Passport Office containing the new British passport, every single visa page, has the watermark of William Shakespeare. How about that? Embedded on every page. The new passport celebrates the creative United Kingdom, so among portraits of, John Constable's there, the clockmaker John Harrison, the work of contemporary artists like Anish Kapoor and Anthony Gormley, along with iconic images of Stevenson's rocket and the penny black. But another surprise awaits, because you turn to one page celebrating great British architecture, and here is our own Elizabeth Scott. Who, you cry? Well, Elizabeth Scott was the architect of the 1932 Shakespeare Memorial Theatre in Stratford-upon-Avon. Her face is unfamiliar to many. Indeed, it was unfamiliar to us when we redesigned the theatre in 2007 to 2011 and could scarcely find a picture of poor old Elizabeth Scott. But here she is in a natty cloche hat, with behind her the 2010 iteration of the Royal Shakespeare Theatre. So I'm very delighted to see her there. Yeah, as expected, Shakespeare was everywhere last year. The Post Office brought out a special set of stamps with quotations from the plays. The Royal Mint produced a set of 3 brilliant uncirculated Shakespeare £2 coins with images of Yorick's skull for tragedy, a dagger and crown for history, presumably, and a jester's hat and marotte for comedy. There was even a Shakespeare country file on the BBC. In Stratford, the whole town rose to the occasion of its most famous son's jubilee. The Shakespeare Birthplace Trust opened a splendid new redevelopment of New Place, the site of the house Shakespeare bought in 1597, for £60. Not, I think, what the redevelopment cost, which I think was £6 million. King Edward's School, Shakespeare's alma mater, opened his schoolroom to the public, reminding me of the story of the pupil who, when told that Shakespeare was born and died on the same day, asked, how did he manage to write so many plays then? At the RSC, our project for 2016 was to introduce as many new audiences to Shakespeare as we could. And we decided we'd do that in 4 different ways. Internationally, through a visit to China for the very first time, and a residency in New York. Nationally, regionally, and locally, with a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, by reaching a more diverse audience via our casting decisions, and a younger one by employing the latest innovations in digital technology. We launched the Jubilee year in the Barbican in January by assembling Shakespeare's great history cycle, which we called King and Country. The idea of putting Shakespeare's history plays together in a cycle is a very Stratford one. In fact, as far as I'm aware, the first time this ever happened was in Stratford-upon-Avon in 1901, when Frank Benson mounted The Week of Kings, and the Irish playwright and poet W.B. Yeats arrived in Stratford and immersed himself in a series of these plays and praised the way one performance enhanced his understanding of the others. And he said, "I have seen this week King John, Richard II, the second part of Henry IV, Henry V, the second part of Henry VI, and Richard III, played in their right order, with all the links that bind play to play unbroken, and partly because of a spirit in this place, and partly because of the way play supports play, the theatre has moved me as it has never done before." When we opened Elizabeth Scott's Shakespeare Memorial Theatre with the Henry IVs in 1932, and 50 years later we opened the Barbican with those same plays. We celebrated the Festival of Britain with the cycle in 1951, with Richard Burton playing Hal. And in 1964, of course, for the tercentenary of Shakespeare's birth, Peter Hall and John Barton defined their view of the new Royal Shakespeare Company by mounting an anti-heroic cycle of both history cycles, referred to as the Wars of the Roses. Adrian Noble marked the millennium with all the histories, directed by different directors. Michael Boyd directed the first tetralogy at that time, and then a decade ago, his crowning achievement as artistic director was to put the two tetralogies together, from Richard II to Richard III. At moments of national celebration, we like to re-identify ourselves through Shakespeare's mythology of nationhood. So mounting the second tetralogy for the 400th seemed an entirely appropriate way to mark that occasion. I chose to direct them individually. I started with Richard II with David Tennant in 2013, mounting the Henry IVs the following summer with Anthony Sher, who is my partner and who's sitting on the front row, as Falstaff, as Sir John. And then in 2015, to coincide serendipitously with the 600th anniversary of the Battle of Agincourt, we did Henry V with Alex Hassel. So we examined all the plays first in their own right before tetralogizing them, as it were. Putting it another way, we looked at Richard III as a great lyric tragedy in its own right, rather than as a sort of prequel to Henry IV. Then we pulled out all those themes and cross-casting ideas to thread the four plays together. And then, for good measure, we took them to China. To mark the 400th anniversary and to reach new audiences internationally, we mounted the first tour of the People's Republic ever undertaken by the RSC with productions from our main repertoire. This felt genuinely like breaking new ground. Shakespeare's popularity is indeed growing in China, but Henry IV and Henry V had never been performed there before. I suggested that we play down the folio classification of the plays as histories, as this might imply that they would only be appreciated by a British audience. And indeed, that classification belies the riotous comedy of the Gad's Hill plot and the tavern scenes in particular. In Beijing, in Shanghai, in Hong Kong, the audiences delighted in those plays, recognizing the troubled relationships of fathers and sons, the dynastic power struggles, the political outmaneuverings and backstabbings as a reflection of their own experience. We then undertook a 6-week residency in New York at the Brooklyn Academy of Music with the entire cycle. And New York embraced the event with enormous enthusiasm. And guess what? Bette Midler turned up. Of all the Hollywood stars that might have turned up to see Henry IV Parts 1 and 2, who would have thought? There was Bette in the front row. I returned to Shanghai in November to watch a production of Henry V at the Shanghai Dramatic Arts Centre. As part of our deeper engagement with China, we've been working on new Chinese translations of Shakespeare in theatrically viable, actor-friendly, audience-accessible versions. This translation of Henry V had been prepared in Stratford during our rehearsals, with Chinese writers embedded in the rehearsal room, listening to us as we went through the process that was just described to you, of working through the plays. Because for us as contemporary actors and directors, the language is 400 years old and needs translating to really understand what it is about. So we shared that with our Chinese colleagues, our theatre colleagues. And that was the production, that translation, which was being performed in Shanghai that I went to see, performed by Chinese actors and directed by my associate on the King and Country cycle, Owen Horsley. And initially, the actors regarded the choice of play with skepticism. Henry V, why do a play about English history? But very quickly, the play emerged as a play about war and presented a spectrum of perspectives about war, from jingoistic patriotism to cynical exploitation, from selfless heroism to ruthless propaganda. And the Chinese recognized that just as any British audience would do. Indeed, I asked one of the young Chinese actors what the experience of doing Henry V had been like for them. He said it had not only changed his view of Shakespeare, it had changed his attitude to his entire job as an actor. Meanwhile, at home, our national strategy to reach new faces in collaboration with our regional theatre partners and associated schools programme was a bold, challenging, and quite possibly insane idea. It was certainly an absurdly ambitious endeavour. We produced a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, but Bottom and the Rude Mechanicals would be played by a local amateur group in every place we visited, from Belfast to Blackpool. And Titania's Fairy Train would be played by local school children. 580 local school kids took part in that production, and as has been frequently said, Titania kissed 12 bottoms. That experience produced inevitably some priceless responses from amateurs, pupils, and teachers alike. Take the teacher in Launceston, down in the southwest, who said of her pupils, "They came home covered with fairy dust, and now that dust is rubbing off around the school and around the local community." And she attests to the power of Shakespeare to change young lives. Their confidence has grown, she says. Their work in drama and English lessons has improved. And other students have started to believe, if them, then why not me? Launceston will remember what we called Dream 16 for generations. Or take the town councillor, who got to his feet in a post-show discussion in Blackpool, in the Grand Theatre, and said the production had marked a turn in the town's fortunes. Or the retired sales manager from the amateur group in Bradford, who said it was like a dream come true. It's the equivalent, he said, for an amateur of a Sunday League footballer who's selected to play in the World Cup final. Or, and I have to say, this is my personal favourite, the 5-year-old boy who stood up at the end of the performance in Stratford and said to his parents, "That is the best experience of my entire life." Aged 5, bless him. Of course, as well as the tours and events which were especially created to celebrate the Jubilee year, there was also business as usual in Stratford-upon-Avon. But even here, we decided that our choice of plays should address new audiences, and this was certainly the case with the opening play. The first of our summer season in Stratford-on-Avon would be Hamlet. Hamlet himself says that the purpose of playing both at the first and now was and is, as 'twere, to hold the mirror up to nature. Theatre should hold a mirror up to nature. But if a significant percentage of the population do not recognise their reflection in that mirror, then we are certainly not doing our job. In this very special year, we cast the brilliant 25-year-old Papa Essiedu as the prince, the first black actor ever to play Hamlet on the main stage at Stratford, and not before time. Indeed, it's only this year, 2017, that we have our first black Cleopatra on the main stage in Stratford in Josette Simon. RSC board member Sandy Okoro described the profound effect our production of Hamlet had upon her. I cannot describe what it was like to see a majority black cast perform Hamlet on the main stage of the RSC. It filled me with pride, and for the first time, I felt part of something instead of wanting to be part of something. For me, she said, it's so much more than just another RSC production. It's about the things that inspire us. Inspiration is the ethereal fairy dust that fires the imagination, and imagination is the invisible wand of change. Papa took part in a sketch for the star-studded gala we devised with the BBC for Shakespeare's birthday. Shakespeare Live from the RSC celebrated Shakespeare's influence in all the performing arts, from opera, ballet, jazz, rap, and musical theatre. The sketch was called A Line of Hamlets. It began with Papa delivering the most famous line in the canon: "To be or not to be, that is the question." However, at that point, he was interrupted by Tim Minchin, suggesting an alternative word stress: to be or not to be. That is the question. Tim was then interrupted by Benedict Cumberbatch, who came on stage with another emphasis, who was then challenged by Harriet Walter, then, to the growing delight of the audience, by David Tennant, by Rory Kinnear, and by Sir Ian McKellen. Then, by Dame Judi Dench herself in inky doublet and hose, declaring, "'Tis I, Hamlet the Dame." And then, in an unexpected coup de théâtre, our president, the Prince of Wales himself, walked on stage to bring the matter to a close, suggesting that surely the emphasis was on the final word: to be or not to be, that is the question. Not unsurprisingly, we were trending on Twitter within minutes, and the clip is still available on YouTube. The sketch had a serious purpose, in a way. It satirized assumptions about who could play the Prince of Denmark. A black guy like Papa, a woman like Harriet, or even, as Tim Minchin protested, a ginger Aussie, who instead, and indeed the sketch celebrated just how open to translation and interpretation that plays and speeches are, and that there's no definitive way of presenting Shakespeare. And if the Jubilee year told us anything, surely it told us that. Then, as the celebrity lineup exited the stage, and with effortless grace, I might say, Papa delivered the entire soliloquy in his own way. Some of my personal highlights from Shakespeare Live were Rufus Wainwright singing his version of Sonnet 29, When in Disgrace with Fortune and Men's Eyes, the ravishing nocturne duet from Berlioz's Beatrice and Benedick, and Akala and Nitin Sawhney's Shakespeare rap. Dancers from Birmingham Royal Ballet dancing to Duke Ellington's Such Sweet Thunder, and from the Royal Ballet dancing Prokofiev's Romeo and Juliet. The 4 of Shakespeare's songs expressing the seasons of Shakespeare's life, interpreted by the country duo The Shires, the bluesy brilliant Alison Moyet, the jazz great Gregory Porter, and the masterful classical tenor Ian Bostridge. Robert McCrum in The Observer summed up the whole extraordinary evening. Shakespeare Live was an apt and vivid reminder of the playwright's chameleon brilliance, his astonishing powers of assimilation, and the way in which the inspired juxtapositions of his language and poetry can ignite the cortical synapses of the imagination like no one in our literature. Shakespeare, at once timeless and universal, speaks for the world. The summer season in Stratford continued with Cymbeline, regendered as a character in Melly Still's Brexit-inflected production to Queen Cymbeline. Regendering became something of a trend in 2016 too, in Stratford and elsewhere. We also celebrated some other important anniversaries. The 400th anniversary of the death of the great Spanish novelist, the Prince of Wits, Miguel de Cervantes, who died on the same date, though not the same day, as Shakespeare. We marked this with a new production of Don Quixote, adapted by James Fenton, and David Threlfall, deliriously good as the Knight of the Woeful Countenance, and we hope to be bringing that production to town. And the 400th anniversary of the publication of Ben Jonson's first folio. No other playwright, and remember, Jonson invented that word, playwright, had ever dared to risk publishing his own dramatic works in an expensive folio edition before. And had Ben Jonson not had the ego, or perhaps that's the sheer chutzpah, to do so, I think it is unlikely that Shakespeare's mates, Hemmings and Condell, would ever have thought of putting William's work together in a single volume 7 years later. So we mounted a production to celebrate Jonson's 400th anniversary by putting on his great farce, The Alchemist, to mark that anniversary. Then in June, we started rehearsing King Lear. In the week, indeed, of the Brexit vote. Exploring a play about the disastrous consequences of dividing a country seemed particularly resonant. Shakespeare really does act like a magnet, attracting all the iron filings of what is going on in the world around him. Professor Jim Shapiro said at the start of our rehearsals, "I go to the newspapers to find out what is happening in the world. I go to Shakespeare to explain it." The play powerfully reflected the world of 2016. King Lear, driven out into the storm by his exhausted daughters, catches sight of the vagrant population who, like him, can find no shelter from the rain. "You houseless poverty," he calls them. There follows, I think, a very surprising epiphany about the social injustice Lear sees around him. "Poor naked wretches, wheresoe'er you are that bide the pelting of this pitiless storm, how shall your houseless heads and unfed sides, your lopped and windowed raggedness, defend you from seasons such as these?" Walk around Trafalgar Square and you'll see exactly those people. Then comes his realization not of his own failure to take action on their behalf during his reign, but his failure to have noticed the poor at all. And notice how simple and direct Shakespeare's language can be when he's saying something profound. He talks in monosyllables. "Oh, I have ta'en too little care of this." And then he advocates a course of action few in power would follow for more than a photo opportunity. "Take physic pomp, expose thyself to feel what wretches feel, that thou mayest shake the superflux to them and show the heavens more just. Try experiencing what these poor homeless vagrants feel for however short a time, and we might be impelled to shake the superflux to them, redistribute the excess wealth, and have a more just society as a result." In 2016, we became ever more aware of the desperate plight of displaced people. 5 million Syrian refugees fleeing Aleppo, terrified immigrants battered by the Mediterranean and scrambling onto the shores of Lesbos and Lampedusa, and overcrowded camps at Calais. And yet the 6 richest countries, which own half the world's wealth, according to Oxfam, are currently hosting less than 9% of those refugees. Ian McKellen delivered a little-known Shakespeare speech at the Shakespeare Live event in Stratford, Thomas More's speech, addressing a May Day riot at which the crowd have turned on the foreign immigrants to London. He puts the stranger's case, asking the rioters to imagine they are immigrants, plodding with their poor luggage and their babies on their backs to the coastal ports, hoping for safe harbour elsewhere. What reception would they hope to receive, and what example are they giving? More's speech seemed to articulate the Liberal response to the migration crisis. But if there was any humanitarian response to the migrant crisis, the backlash was quick to follow, as across the globe, it seemed, scaremongers produced posters with scary long lines of refugees or threatened to build walls to keep out such pestilent hordes. like Lear, we might recognize the iniquity, the inequality, the injustice, but also indeed, like Lear, we seem to do very little about it. Nevertheless, I was very moved by how our production struck unexpected chords across the world. Since we began our journey through the canon of Shakespeare's plays under my aegis, we have recorded each one, broadcasting them live into cinemas across the world. Just how far these broadcasts reach was brought home to me by an email I received from a lady in Montana. She had seen the screening of Lear in a converted barn in a little town called Fishtail in Stillwater County on a bend in the Rosebud River on the edge of the Custer Forest in the shadow of the Beartooth Mountains. Can you get deeper into cowboy country than that? The audience, she said, was bus full of kids from Red Lodge and people from all over the state who'd driven there for the performance. My correspondent wrote, "The cast was mesmerizing," and then said, in capital letters, "It was so cool." My favorite review of the year. As a result of our live from broadcasts, we can also stream the productions for free into schools across the UK. And we target schools from socially and economically deprived backgrounds. The data from these performances suggest that we've reached a phenomenal number of young people from very diverse backgrounds who are not only seeing Shakespeare for the first time, but also watching a theatre performance for the first time too. So, to The Tempest, which I mentioned earlier. The last production in our main house in Stratford for Shakespeare's Jubilee was something of an innovation. The Tempest, our production, employs technology which has never been seen before on the stage. And during its Stratford run, attracted record numbers of young people into our audiences, intrigued by how this cutting edge, or as I now have learned to call it, bleeding edge technology actually works. I was aware that in writing The Tempest, Shakespeare had referenced the masks that had become all the rage at the Jacobean court in the early 1600s. Multimedia experiences involving astonishing lighting effects, incredible stage machinery, revolves, transformation techniques, which would challenge us to reproduce today. I wanted to discover what the equivalent 21st century technology might be. So I discussed it with my team. And my head of digital sent me a YouTube clip of a speech by the CEO of the technology giant Intel at a conference in Las Vegas. So he's there in this big room, and behind him are 3 large screens. And if you can imagine, onto the first screen, huge screen, swims this enormous whale, and then swims onto the next, and everybody goes, "Oh, wonderful." And then the CEO says, "Hey, impressive, yeah, but what if it could do this?" The whale turned to face the audience, swam through the screen and over their heads. And I said, "I want that for The Tempest." Didn't think any more of it, but rather brilliantly, my team got in touch with Intel and asked them if they'd be interested in collaborating in 2 years' time with the Royal Shakespeare Company on a production of The Tempest. And guess what? They said yes. And 2 years of research later, here we are. So, employing this extraordinary new technology by Intel, engineered by the creative geniuses behind the Imaginarium Studios run by Andy Serkis, who some of you will know as King Kong in the Peter Jackson film, and indeed Gollum in all the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings films. Andy and his team got to work with us on creating an avatar of Ariel, so that he can indeed ride on the curled clouds, float above the stage. So what you see on the stage is an actor in basically a mocap volume suit, which is a sensor suit that follows his skeleton, and then the avatar that is produced by the projectors filming him with no latency at all, doing exactly the same thing in the air above him. I knew this was cutting-edge, bleeding-edge technology when I discovered that Lady Gaga was trying to get the same technology, and we had got there before. I think what we were trying to do was see if we could create a tempest that really would capture the imagination. It's so often when I've seen that play in the past that somehow the production doesn't match up to my own imagination of the play. Anyway, you can judge for yourselves if you haven't already seen it or seen it in the cinema. We'll bring it to the Barbican this summer and are currently exploring invitations to bring it to the States and indeed to China. But the technology is quite new, it's changing all the time, and I suspect even by the time we get to the Barbican, there will be new and different ways of projecting the avatars of Ariel and indeed the mask. But however sophisticated the technology is, it's Shakespeare's words that cast the most powerful spell, and that will always be our goal, to deliver those words so they can resonate most vividly in our audience's minds wherever they may be. Many people write to me about their own personal experiences. One woman wrote to share how Shakespeare had helped her when her firstborn daughter died at the age of 3. She remembered the words spoken by Gertrude at the side of Ophelia's grave. "I thought thy bride bed to have decked, sweet maid, and not to have strewed thy grave." Those words soothed her somehow, she said. And then, while we were doing The Tempest, I got an extraordinary letter. And I was reminded of Shakespeare's ability to provide words where words fail. It came from a lady called Caroline Sams, and I'd like to conclude this bit of the chat by reading you some of that letter. So Caroline was 3 years old when her parents moved to Hong Kong in 1954. Her father worked for the Navy. He was 33, tall, charming, and athletic. But he contracted polio in an outbreak that afflicted the island colony the following year, 55. And within a week, he was dead. Caroline also contracted the disease, as did her mother, who lost the baby she was carrying, a boy. Caroline remembers the Navy burying her father at sea. His body, sewn into a weighted canvas sack and draped in the Union Jack, was slipped into the ocean in Deepwater Bay. They returned to England, where her mother rarely spoke of her father again, except on one occasion. Caroline asked what had happened to her father when his body slipped under the waves. Her mother said, "Oh, darling, the sharks would have got him." And that was to haunt Caroline for many years of her young life. Then one day at boarding school, they started to read Shakespeare around the class. And a girl stood up and read Ariel's song. "Full fathom 5 thy father lies. Of his bones are coral made. Those are pearls that were his eyes." Caroline said from that time, all her nightmares ceased instantly. And she knew her father had merely suffered a sea change into something rich and strange. Sublime. Years later, Caroline and her husband and youngest daughter returned to Hong Kong and floated little paper boats out into Deepwater Bay to commemorate her father. On each was written, "Full fathom 5, thy father lies." A touching farewell, and perhaps the most beautiful example of the power of Shakespeare to articulate our human story that I came across in his entire Jubilee year. Ladies and gents, 2016 was quite a year in many, many ways. But in terms of Shakespeare's anniversary, and certainly for us at the Royal Shakespeare Company, I think we reached some of the aims we set out to achieve, though there's still a lot of work to do. Through our international reach, both through tours and residencies in China and New York and elsewhere, through our broadcasts reaching as far afield as indeed Fishtail, Montana, through our Dream 16 tours touching local communities and changing perceptions of Shakespeare, of theatre, of the RSC all over the country, through our productions like Hamlet determined to reflect the diversity of our population, and through our use of the latest technology to engage a newer, younger audience. This endeavour has, I hope, been the hallmark of our work in 2016 and beyond, or indeed, should I say, the watermark. Because like the watermark of the Chandos portrait of Shakespeare in the new UK passport, certainly Shakespeare runs like a watermark through all of our work, constantly present, identifying a standard of excellence and inspiring us all, I hope, to achieve it. Thank you. Thank you very much. We have two roving mics, one here at the front and one at the back. So if anybody does have any questions, I think we've got an answer for a few. Gentleman there.
Hi there. It's not on. That's fine. Thank you for the talk. It was wonderful. Is it on? Is it on?
I think you've got a big voice. I'll repeat.
Thank you for the talk. It was wonderful. The one thing that you said that particularly resonates, I think, is that Shakespeare is comedian-like. He speaks to so many different people. But as I think John Barton did in playing Shakespeare, there seems to have been two different traditions of performing Shakespeare. That is the grandiose, Richard Burton-esque, John Gielgud, etc., to the now more naturalistic Pape Sigu or any other of the Anthony Sher, any of the other number of actors we have today. Why is it, do you think, that we moved so markedly from this one grandiose to the more naturalistic? And what are your thoughts on that change?
I'm guessing everybody basically heard that question. I think it's a very interesting question, and I think marrying the two traditions has been part of what John Barton's work has been all about. And, you know, it is astonishing to me that John, and indeed Cis Berry at the age of 90, are still working at Stratford. I did a workshop with Cis, a few months ago, just before Christmas. And I think both of them would say that it's kinetic, the whole notion of how you use Shakespeare. And partly it's to do with the size of the theatre you are trying to reach. As the theatres got bigger, that required a different kind of delivery and more out front. I think as different traditions took over in the 20th century, whether that's film and television, whether that's studio theatres as opposed to the great big spaces. I know that Judi Dench would say that behind it, you have to have the core of truth. And as long as you have that truth, it's a matter of how you communicate that. I was taught that by Terry Hands, who I was his assistant on a production of Romeo and Juliet. Mark Rylance was playing Romeo, so you can tell how long ago it was. And we were doing, he was rehearsing in the Swan Theatre, a galleried thrust space. He was rehearsing Juliet's speech where she has the poison, or the potion that has been given to her by the friar. And the actress was rehearsing this very intimately, very much to herself. You could say very televisually. And she went, "What if this be a poison? The friar subtly hath ministered to have me dead." And Terry said, "Who are you talking to?" And she said, "Myself." And he said, pointing around this beautiful theatre, "Who are all these people?" And she said, "Well, the audience." And he said, "No, they are your sounding boards. They are your friends. They are your confidants. Talk to them." So she tried the speech again, and she went, "What if this be a poison? The friar subtly hath ministered to have me dead." And I thought, I don't know. Because she had engaged me personally. I was complicit in that decision to take that poison or decide whether that potion was a poison or not. Instead of just sitting back in the dark in my comfortable chair, worrying about the poor girl's dilemma. And I think that was, so in a way, the need to communicate not just to yourself, but to the 1,000 people in the audience, or the 400 people in the audience, or the 150 people in the audience. If you're talking to them, your voice will reach them. I think there are lots of other issues around that question. It's a very big question. But I think, to me, that's at the essence of it, which is, if you're not just talking to yourself, but you are talking to the entire house, then it is your job to reach that house with whatever technique you have learned. Thank you. Another question.
In the introduction, it was introduced that you hope to direct the canon. And I just wondered if you could name 2 or 3 plays, perhaps, that you think are underplayed, and what your hopes might be for them.
Yes, that question usually comes as, what is your favourite Shakespeare play? And I can usually answer it very simply by saying, the one I'm doing at the moment. I have, I guess, yes. At Stratford, I think I have done over 2/3 of the canon, so still a few to go. And so I'm inevitably going to say Henry VI parts 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to do Troilus and Cressida in a couple of years' time. I'm really looking forward to that. I think that's a really challenging and extraordinary play, and indeed John Barton's favourite play. I think there are certain plays that seem to speak to the moment in a very powerful, potent way, and I think Troilus is one of those. As indeed are the Roman plays at the moment. We're rehearsing them. They're about to open in Stratford, and it is quite extraordinary they just seem to resonate. They seem to articulate what we feel about power and ambition, and what people will do to seize that power in a very post-truth world. So I don't know how Shakespeare did it, but I think he did it by remaining very alert to what was going on in the world. So I'm not sure that answers your question, but from my own personal point of view, I think I'm the luckiest guy in the world to be able to follow through as many of Shakespeare's plays as I already have at Stratford, because you work with the very, very best people in the world who arrive in Stratford, not just in fact the theatre, but the resource that we have in Stratford, the Shakespeare Institute, the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, the archives that we have, the collections that we have, make you see that Shakespeare, certainly in Stratford, is part of a continuum. Continuum that goes back 130 whatever it is years to 1879, back to David Garrick, I suppose, in 1769. And that continuum can be both inspiring and intimidating. And the danger is that you start doing the Shakespeare in reflection or in reaction to the last production. And when I became artistic director, one of my goals was to make sure that each of the plays, every time we did those plays, would be an event for whatever reason that was, either by the conversation between the plays, by the conversation between the plays in the main house, the Shakespeare's, and indeed the Shakespeare's contemporaries, or the new work that went alongside it, or indeed the casting or the ensemble that we pulled together for that. And I think that's a very important thing. We do a lot of Shakespeare these days. We had a wonderful time working on King Lear last year, but my goodness, there were a lot of King Lears. With Glenda Jackson at the Old Vic, of course, Don Warrington with Tallower, Michael Pennington, and I'm sure I've just missed the most famous one. But anyway, quite a few. What one have I missed? And yes, Timothy West at Bristol, of course. And I think the point is that all of those productions serve a different audience, and all of those productions will find something different, because the only way of doing Shakespeare is not to try and create the definitive production, but to understand the play and interpret it through your own hearts and who you are addressing that play in the time in which you're addressing it. So that's, for us in 2016, that play meant something very particular. And we've made a film of it. It's a broadcast. I'm very proud of that. However, I also suspect that in 10 years' time, it will have been superseded by another approach to the play which reflects the decades to come. Yes.
Greg, you spoke of your efforts to expand the base for people to see Shakespeare, and talked about all the wonderful creative moments you've had, not just in 2016, but for many years. I was struck by the success in America of this play called Hamilton, and it terribly creative in my mind, and used some of the things that you mentioned in terms of very mixed cast. Can you give us your reactions to that outstanding?
Indeed. The question, for those who might not have heard it at the back, is about Hamilton, which of course is the rave hit on Broadway. Soon to be, I guess, a rave hit here in London too. And how I would reflect on that in terms of its ways of it's breaking new ground. And I loved it, I have to say. I thought it was extraordinary, and I thought it was Shakespearean. And I did think the way that production breaks down the story of American history, and a particular story of American history, in such a way to make that not the preserve of a particular section of that community, but to recognize that American history is the possession of all Americans now. And I thought that was extraordinary, and indeed much the same in a way as we were doing with Hamlet, with Papa Essiedu and a complete, not an entirely black cast, of saying, you know, these plays are not the preserve of an intellectual middle class male white preserve. They are for everybody. And for me, and I don't mean by these plays are for everybody, but that doesn't mean we have to dumb them down in order to have them appreciated. What we need to do is open people's ears to them, and you do that in many, many different ways. I love the Greek classics, but I got hooked by Harry Hockhausen's film of Jason and the Argonauts with all those funny plastic characters. And I thought, wow, this is a great world. I want to know a bit more about that. So how you get engaged in Shakespeare, there are a billion ways. I think the exciting thing is to become engaged. And I hope that's what we try and do in Stratford. And I think the live from sequence that we've been able to do has really helped that. It was a really tricky start, I might say, in that we were the first theatre company to be approached to do a live broadcast after the Met in New York had done the opera. With a production of Hamlet that I did with David Tennant and Patrick Stewart. But there was a nervousness among the company that, well, it's okay to fluff your lines in front of 1,000 people for one night, but not to be preserved forever in front of possibly 1 million people. But that maybe the argument was that theatre is a ephemeral, transient experience and should be left as such. I think we didn't at that point do it, though we did make a film of that production. And I thought we were going to be rather behind the wave if we didn't actually catch up to that. Because I think what it has done really has brought Shakespeare and the experience of the Royal Shakespeare Company and, of course, the National Theatre do it spectacularly well too, of allowing people to come and see Shakespeare and test it out, because the theatre can be an intimidating place. On the first night of when we broadcast live the David Tennant Richard II, we got a tweet which said, "I am really loving seeing David Tennant play Richard II in my UCI Whiteley's cinema, eating my chicken korma." And I thought, well, I'm glad I'm not sitting next to you, but if that's how you want your Shakespeare, if that's how you're kind of going, I'm not sure I'm going to go all the way to Stratford or pay that amount of money, but actually maybe in the cinema. And it's extraordinary how, and we have now evidence to back this up, how people have tried that out, tried another one maybe, come and seen the RSC on tour, or make their way to Stratford. And I think that's great. And I think the important thing, as with all the new digital technology, is to be not to be afraid of that, not to seem as though somehow we are going to be intimidated by the technology, and that we should rather, in a rather puritanical way, perhaps stand up and say, no, it must be pure, it must just be an actor on stage spouting Shakespeare. I'm sure that's not the way. I'm sure it will always at Stratford be the live actors in front of the live audience in that moment, because that's what makes Shakespeare so extraordinary. It's different every night. That doesn't mean that you can't find methods of inviting people in who, whether they're in Fishtail, Montana, or Indiana, come to that, I guess. Topical reference. There are lots and lots of ways of doing that, and I think that's our job in the 21st century. Yes.
I'm curious, you mentioned Brexit a couple times in your presentation, but for the Americans in the audience, I don't think there's a reference to Donald Trump. And so I'm wondering,
I thought you'd have picked that up.
The New York Times referenced in an article last week that George Orwell mentioned before is now a bestseller again. And there have been lots of articles and a lot of newspapers about what books you should be reading to understand the Trump phenomenon. So I would like to ask you, what plays should we be reading to understand the Trump phenomenon?
Do you know, the Rome season at the moment just has Donald Trump printed like letters through a stick of rock. I'm going to do, in fact, at the end of the year, I'm doing a new 6-part adaptation. That is 6 plays, 6-hour-long plays over 2 nights of Robert Harris's Cicero trilogy. And I don't know whether any of you have read those, but they are absolutely magnificent books. They are The West Wing meets Ancient Rome. And since we received the first drafts, maybe nearly a year ago, those books and those references to those characters in ancient Rome have gained just extra currency. Well, I mean, Donald Trump could be cast as Catiline, not as Cicero. But there are, certainly not as Cicero, but there are, well, Julius Caesar himself. There are, if he's free by then, and a lot of us hope he might be, he would be very welcome to come and perform at the Royal Shakespeare Company in some of those roles. Any last questions? Just one there.
You talk about the balance between meeting your modern audience and keeping the new audiences engaged, and also treating the plays with the honesty and truth they deserve as such old pieces of work. I was wondering what you think about, in relation to other Shakespeare producing houses, that's been quite a hot topic in the last year, how you think that balance is working, and how you're going to meet the challenges of that in future generations in terms of light, sound, performance, gender, all these kind of things that are big topics in the last kind of 5 or 6 months.
Yes, well, good question. I mean, clearly, I went to see Harriet Walter doing the Tempest. It was a rather extraordinary thing, because I know Harriet very, very well, having directed her as Lady M and Cleopatra and Beatrice. And there was a point where she and Phillida started on Henry IV, just as we were doing Henry IV. And then Julius Caesar, just as I was doing Julius Caesar. And I said, what are you doing next, by the way? And she said, yeah, I know, The Tempest, yeah. I think Shakespeare is robust. I think he will, allow of many interpretations. And I think there is a real and important movement. Phillida, I invited Phillida to come to Stratford a few years ago, and she said, I can't come to Stratford while the company is unless the company is 50% men and women. In fact, if you look at the company overall, we're 60% women and 40% men. That's not reflected always on our stages. And I think what Phillida has, she didn't come, alas, I hope she does at some point. I think it just bears witness to the fact that it is, as I say, kinetic. I think you learn all sorts of things, all sorts of different lines come out, different situations come out that are completely different if they're played by women or if they, the genders are reversed. It's not a new thing. in the 1660s at the Restoration, when women took over the roles from the boys, they were such a novelty that there was a play by Killigrew called The Parson's Wedding, in which they decided that they would reverse all the genders, and the women would play all the men's parts and the men would play all the women's parts. We haven't done that at Stratford quite yet. We've done a bit like that, but not quite. I think in terms of the Globe, I think that was an unfortunate situation of I think the board should have been behind her a bit, is my honest feeling about Emma Rice. Having appointed her, I think they should have seen it through. But I think what she does is something very special, and I think they should have known that before they appointed her. But she is a very special talent. She brings a very different kind of sense of diversity. Having Helena played by a man and just making it a gay relationship seems great to me. Having, just as Simon Godwin's going to do Twelfth Night with Tamsin Greig as Malvolia, and that brings other very real and contemporary resonances to what that relationship is, what Malvolia feels about Olivia, and what the prejudice around her is, which maybe has become a little dull otherwise. So I think there are lots of things to learn. There are just a million ways of doing it. It's a bit like Terry Hand said to me, there are a million ways of doing Shakespeare however you want to do it. There isn't a right way or a wrong way. And I think some people, there have been calls for moratorium on Shakespeare. We've seen enough now already. There's a big enough audience. If we're doing a King Lear in Stratford, there's an audience at the Old Vic. If we're at the Barbican, we didn't suffer at the Barbican doing King Lear, nor did the Old Vic with Glenda Jackson. So I think you can sort of have it as you like it. And that's probably a good point to stop.